Hi, my name is Seth Zeiter, and this is the reflection I did on my life history interview for EBOL 585. So I'll start where I started with my assignment, which is the interviewee, my mother-in-law, Hong Fungan. She currently lives in Shanghai, but she grew up in a small village in Anhui called Uwei. And I've been to Uwei, and currently it's fairly urban. Lots of buildings very close together, lots of cars, hotels, shopping malls, that kind of thing. But even when my wife was growing up in Uwe, she described it as kind of this farming village where they kind of mess around and do silly things like steal watermelons and whatnot. And my mother-in-law describes much the same thing. During the interview, she told me about a time that or not a time, but something that she did frequently with her friends is after they got out of school, they'd go and pick up these root vegetables like radishes and potatoes, and then throw them in a bundle of hay and grass and light the hay and grass on fire to cook the root vegetables. This is kind of a situation that they were living in at the time. And there was a lot of farming going on uh, where it wasn't this mass commercialized farming, but really farming for subsistence, with some money made on the side, but that wasn't the primary purpose of it. So the reason I wanted to interview my mother-in-law is that she grew up in an interesting time and place. I knew before the interview that it was sometime around the Mao era opening up period, that transition, which to me is a very interesting time in education history in China because Deng Xiaoping kind of overturned everything that Mao Zedong did without really explicitly saying that he did. And so I figured someone living in a village in a rural area where Mao was probably quite popular, what her perception might have been. And what I actually ended up learning is that there wasn't really anything that changed, that they were kind of living their own reality that was un mostly unaffected by politics and policies, and instead they were just kind of meeting their needs from day to day. Another reason that I wanted to interview her is that she never, quote unquote, really learned Mandarin. Um, so Mandarin's the standard language of mainland China, and when I talk to my mother-in-law, it is extremely difficult. My Chinese isn't great, but I am conversational. I can have basic conversations, but I cannot understand my mother-in-law a good chunk of the time. And an in-law joked shortly after I got married. She asked me, "Can you understand? Can you understand Fungun?" And I said, "No, I have a pretty hard time understanding her." And she said, "Yeah, we do too." So this was always a question that was in the back of my mind about why is it that she doesn't speak the super standard Mandarin. Other people her age have a non-standard dialect of Mandarin, but it's generally intelligible. Sorry. Um, if you listen carefully and they speak slowly, you can kind of negotiate a meaning with limited Mandarin. But with her, it's extremely difficult. Um, and one interesting thing that I ended up learning about my mother-in-law is she had some heavily disrupted schooling. She only went for 5 years. During the interview, I learned that she did this because she viewed education as kind of a means to an end. Her parents and many of her friends' parents only sent their kids to school so they could learn to read and that they could learn some math, and that was kind of it. I focused on Chinese for reasons I described previously, but she only went to school for 5 years, and then once they felt that she had learned enough Mandarin, enough math, they pulled her out, and she described a schooling situation that we would describe as very impoverished. No tables, no desks. Teachers were often without even high school diplomas. Um, They couldn't speak Standard Mandarin, which answers my question of why she couldn't speak Standard Mandarin, because her teachers couldn't, so they couldn't teach it. Very resource light would be describing it very generously. So this is kind of the background of my interviewee, my mother-in-law, and kind of why I was interested in doing this topic in the first place. So when I chose my interviewee, the topic kind of came with it, which is education in China in the post-Mao era. She was born, my subject, my mother-in-law was born while Mao was still alive. Mao died in 1976, and she went to school in 1978. So this would be a very transitional period between Mao's reign of power and Deng Xiaoping's reign of power. So I wanted to kind of explore this opening up, reform, and the potential effects on an individual, in this case my mother-in-law. Anhui is a fairly interesting place at this time in history, so I thought she would have a lot of kind of rich information of firsthand experiences of this opening up and how it changed education. But what I actually ended up figuring out is that she had some immense poverty that she had experienced, and that changed how she lived. And it also highlighted the differences between how she experienced education and how her daughter, my wife, had experienced education growing up, which was obviously not what I wanted to focus on, but that's what her experience was. And I can't deny that, obviously. And it still serves as a very interesting, very kind of insightful, enlightening topic that, again, even though that wasn't the purpose of it, that wasn't going to be the subject that I intended my paper to be about, it was still interesting to hear her experiences in a fairly poor area of Anhui and how she dealt with it. And she didn't talk about it as if she were poor or as if she were not as well off as others. She had pretty good memories of it overall. And so what I thought would be, again, this talk about, oh, education changed a lot for me while I was in school and blah, 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 blah. It was actually, we're kind of insulated, and we didn't really experience anything that was going on outside, minus some concerns with social welfare for speaking out against the government or speaking out against individuals for fear of being labeled a, quote, counter-revolutionary. And aside from that, I didn't really experience any noticeable changes from the federal level policy changes that were happening rapidly during this transition from Mao to Deng Xiaoping. So for techniques, obviously, this was an ethnographic life history done by an interview as per the requirements of the assignment. But even though it was suggested to take notes during the interview, there's so much going on with translation and trying to understand what was going on with the translation. Because even though I said that I have trouble understanding my mother-in-law because her Chinese is so non-standard, I still can understand bits and pieces, and I can understand my wife a little bit better than my mother-in-law, even though they're basically speaking the same dialect. I still wanted to focus on that, so I didn't want to take time away from trying to focus on that by taking notes. So I recorded it on my phone, and then I took after the fact notes from that recording, and I organized those notes into themes and topics, and then I tried to relate those themes to academic research on the subject. And incidentally, it was very difficult for me to find relevant research for this time period on the topic. There's a lot of stuff pre-1949, which is before the formation of the People's Republic of China. There's a lot of stuff post-1976, post-Mao, essentially, because that's when he died. That 1949 to 1976-ish era is fairly devoid of research. I'm not sure if this is a problem with the University of Illinois academic database. I don't know if this is just a problem with this type of research in the field in general. I have had conversations with colleagues and coworkers, about this kind of stuff, and the the regime, if you will, of the Communist Party is very strict about what kind of information stays in China and what information can leave China. So that could be part of the problem. Um, it's a really kind of sticky problem. I did happen to find a few resources that talk somewhat directly and somewhat indirectly about these topics surrounding that time period in a way that I was able to contextualize it for this assignment. But finding research that supported the things that my mother-in-law said directly was a big challenge in doing this assignment. Perhaps this is a bit of a standoffish or cold way of talking about my mother-in-law, but to kind of access my interviewee, it was pretty straightforward. She's my mother-in-law. I said, hey, I need to do this for school. Could you help me out? She said, of course. The difficulties were, though, that she lives in Shanghai, which is about 3 hours from where I live, and I work 45 hours a week, and we've got a son. So logistically, it was hard to get over there. We did end up getting over there and getting it done. Um, and the other difficulty was, of course, that she speaks an extremely divergent version of Mandarin that most people don't understand. However, I can't really complain about this too much because this is kind of the whole reason that I wanted to interview her in the first place. I wouldn't have had as much of an interest in interviewing her if it wasn't so darn hard to understand anything that she was saying, even for native speakers, excluding my wife. Um, so, kind of a double-edged swords there. But as far as gaining access to the interviewee, very easy. Now, one would assume that my positionality would be fairly positive, maybe relatively non-problematic, if you want to say it that way, because I'm son-in-law and I would have generally good favor with my mother-in-law as long as I treated the relationship respectfully. And while that was kind of the case, because again, I'm her son-in-law, we interact quite a bit. The language barrier was a huge disadvantage. I don't talk to her directly that much. I don't really have these deep kind of conversations. If she spoke standard Mandarin, maybe that would be a different story. But with her thick dialect, it is, to be frank, exhausting to have a conversation with her. And so that normally deeper connection that I might have with a mother-in-law who speaks English, it's there, but in a very different kind of way. It's very subtle. So yes, I'm close to her in the sense that we're family, and that's important, but perhaps not as close as I could be had there not been a language barrier there to begin with. There are also some probably unspoken assumptions and acts that I didn't pick up on rather, that are associated with interviewing in Chinese culture. My wife framed this as an interview from the get-go. I wanted to get on this and call it a conversation, but my wife has always kind of got ahead of me and got in there to kind of help me out. So there could be things that interfered that I'm not aware of. And somewhat as I talked about previously, there's a scarcity of information on this time period that I'm trying to talk about in my interview and in my paper. A lot of what I know about history during this period is word of mouth, talking to students, talking to older family members, talking to my wife, talking to a bunch of people. A lot of this history is kind of oral in a sense, even though it could have been written down, even though it probably is written down somewhere. It's very hard to locate, and so a lot of the history that I've heard is very anecdotal. So my understanding of the history is probably very different than her understanding of the history, especially since I grew up in the US, removed thousands of miles from this whole thing in several decades, and she kind of lived through it, and albeit a very different part of China than was probably extensively affected by these policies. Um, but that mismatch of understandings and expectations of history and culture probably played a role that I could not be aware of in some senses. Of course, as with everybody else, I've had difficulties with this interview process, primarily just the personality. My mother-in-law is a very direct person, just kind of no nonsense, just gives you the answer. That's the answer, take it or leave it. I did try to ask non-leading open questions like, do you have anything else to add? But that was pretty much always met with no. I'd ask, anything else? Anything that you can think of? Anything funny? Anything sad? Anything memorable? No. Her answer was her answer. She wasn't going to add or change her answer. It was kind of one and done. Ask the question, okay, what's the next question? And then there's some personal assumptions that I had, obviously, that affected how I approached the topic and probably greatly changed the way that I got information and the kind of information that I got, because I assumed rural China was deeply affected by the Cultural Revolution. I assumed that was where most of the starvation was happening. I assumed that that was where a lot of the persecution and oppression was happening. But really, it wasn't. There was this, it was affected by mass voluntary censorship, but there wasn't really anything else according to my mother-in-law and the accounts that she received from her mother. So this led to a change in topic, which obviously is difficult when you go in with one expectation and you leave with a completely different expectation, very different goal or objective. So these were kind of the two primary difficulties that I had. Obviously I had other ones with just general interviewing procedures, interlocutor kind of problems. I didn't really plan very well for having a translator, that kind of thing. So these are the difficulties that I had primarily. So reflecting on this experience, what went well is I got some very interesting unexpected information. Even though I didn't get to cover the topic that I anticipated I was going to cover, I think I covered something that was much more interesting. I was also able to interview a foreign language speaker, which is obviously more difficult than interviewing someone who speaks the same language as you, so that was pretty good. However, because I was interviewing someone who spoke a language different than the language that I speak natively, there was no real flow from the conversations. Topics were very, one and the next and the next and the next. It didn't go from one naturally into the other. It was just, okay, this is the topic, we've exhausted that topic, this is the topic, we've exhausted that topic. And from this, there was also too many guiding questions. Again, this is partly due to the personality of the interviewee, where I would ask, do you have anything to add? Is there anything else? And I would just get a straight up, no, there isn't. Try to push on with that, and I would just get no, no, no. So that didn't go quite well. I could improve upon that. And what I learned from ethnography about this, I learned a lot about taking people's words at face value, about really valuing the experiences of others and understanding what they went through and trying to contextualize that within the history of what they experienced. And how does this apply to my studies and professional life? I work with ELLs. It's really important to understand their cultural situation and their social situation. So this is what I study and this is what I work at. And understanding ethnographic methods can help me be a better educator, both as a teacher and as an administrator, so that I can better provide for the students that I'm supposed to advocate for. Thank you so much for your time.